Hello, my name is Eric, and I'd like to do a little book review on this book that I picked up from a bookstore. It's by Timothy Leary called The Politics of Ecstasy. So it's basically a collection of essays that Timothy Leary has written or co-authored. Um, Basically, he is a psychedelic researcher. He studied psychology at Harvard, and many of his experiments were about the use of psychedelic drugs. And so, one of the first things it talks about is uh, the effects of psychedelic drugs on individuals that took a moderately high dose of LSD. So, what it says is that uh, people reported having a spiritual experience. So, somewhere in the range of 74% of the people who took it said it was a very profound experience. And so it's basically just a collection of essays that he's written in response to sort of the mainstream media talking about his research. And so what you can discover by reading this book is that Timothy Leary thinks that the future of education, among other things, is going to be influenced by these psychedelic chemicals like peyote and LSD and mushrooms and marijuana. And he sort of categorizes the experiences that you can have in 7 different categories uh, in terms of different drugs that you can take to reach each new level of uh, sort of hallucinogenic experience. And so what he says is that there's 7 levels. Um, each level is progressively smaller in terms of human physiology that it's related to. So, for instance, the first level is the void. So, things like a high dosage of alcohol or other drugs like alcohol that are a sedative uh, would give you sort of this feeling of void, of emptiness. And then the highest dose, or sorry, the highest level is like the universal or genetic level. And things like uh, DMT would be in that category, things that connect you to your cellular memory. And he also says that Buddhism is a way of connecting to this. So he doesn't say you have to take psychedelic drugs to experience these manifestations of reality, of consciousness, different ways of experiencing consciousness. What Leary is saying is that he would like to see in modern education children taking psychedelic drugs and learning about who they are as a person. So I don't really agree with all of what Leary says. The book, in some ways, has not aged well. He talks about LSD being the cure for homosexuality. He relates a story that this beautiful Latin woman who was a lesbian uh, took LSD and then immediately sought out sexual relations with a man. And so he sort of is trapped in the old way of thinking in terms of how mental illness is diagnosed, that he thinks that homosexuality is a mental illness and needs to be cured. So obviously, we know in 2020 that homosexuality is not a mental illness. Uh, it was removed, like 30 years ago from the diagnostic manual of mental health, mental illnesses. Uh, and certainly, we haven't found any evidence that it's beneficial to children for them to take things like mescaline, marijuana, or LSD, um, or mushrooms, even for that matter. We know now that mushrooms can treat things like depression, alcoholism, uh, and pain-related illnesses like cluster headaches, which are also called migraines. So I think that Leary, he didn't he wasn't the be-all and end-all of psychedelic researchers, but he certainly did have some good insights, such as that it can be used as a spiritual tool for furthering your knowledge of spirituality, and also getting to know who you are as a person. I think that Leary sort of bought into the mainstream thinking in some ways, while at the same time being sort of against that sort of way of thinking. That, for example, that homosexuality is an illness, or that people who don't subscribe to this alternative way of thinking, that psychedelics are so great and that everyone should take them. That certainly is not true. And I think one thing I can relate to is what Joe Rogan said, is that if you feel like it's your calling, that you have the urge to take it, and it's not just some passing fantasy or desire, that you really genuinely want to take psychedelic drugs, then by all means you should take them in a safe and sane way. And I think to build on that, certainly that mainstream society, mainstream media, and the mainstream school of thought about psychedelics is that you'll lose your mind, you'll become a different person, you'll be, you'll be worse for the wear after you take psychedelic drugs. And I think that Leary tries to debunk that, even though the arguments don't sometimes make sense in today's context with the knowledge that we have through science nowadays. I'm sure every shaman will agree that psychedelic drugs in particular can be used as a spiritual tool. So it's like owning a car, and some people take it to a mechanic to get it fixed, while other people work on it in their own auto shop, in their garage. They work on it there. Another thing that Leary brings up is that sex is better with LSD. And I think that's a psychosomatic response. I don't think there's any scientific evidence to show that LSD can enhance sex. It's a somatic response, psychosomatic response, where your mind is suddenly tricked into becoming more open. So we know that with LSD and psychedelics, your brain makes new connections. Your brain is becoming wired differently. And so it gives people new ideas in terms of having sex. He claims that women who are taking LSD during sex are going to have thousands of orgasms, hundreds or thousands. And I think that's a bit ridiculous, and he's sort of exaggerating. Maybe he experienced something like that where a woman claimed to have thousands of orgasms. And I'm not saying it's impossible, but it just seems like it wouldn't happen for every single person that took LSD. I don't think there's been any studies of sex in LSD. Maybe there has, but it's certainly not talked about in the mainstream. So I'd just like to say one last thing about this book, is that for anyone who is interested in drug culture, definitely pick up this book at a library or at a bookstore. and take a look through it. It does raise some very interesting points about the use of psychedelics, and a lot of it is just Leary's interpretation of his research. It's not talking too heavily about the empirical results of the research that he's done. So a lot of it is anecdotal evidence. A lot of his writing is about things that have inspired him while taking psychedelics. And just to note, Leary was a daily marijuana smoker, and he took LSD over 300 times, which he says he did once a week. So definitely it's worth the read if you can find it. It's an old book. It was published in, I believe, 62. So it gets a thumbs up from me. That's all for today. Over and out.